The doors of the ballroom burst open, and every candle in the room seemed to shiver at once. Eleanor Ashworth stood on the threshold in her travel-worn cloak, dust still clinging to the hem of her dress, and watched the man she loved lift the hand of another woman in front of 300 guests. Duke Julian Hartwell had just spoken the words that would end her world. He had announced his engagement to Lady Camilla Voss. Eleanor had crossed 2 counties in a hired carriage to reach this ballroom before midnight. She had not stopped to change her dress or comb the dust from her hair, because a letter had reached her that morning, warning her that Julian meant to marry someone else before the week was out. She had told herself it was a mistake, a rumor twisted by jealous tongues. She had believed, with the stubborn faith of a woman in love, that she would arrive in time to stop it. She was too late. The music had not yet resumed. The guests near the door turned first, drawn by the cold gust of night air that followed her inside. Then the turning spread through the crowd like a ripple across still water, until every face in the ballroom was pointed toward her, and until Julian himself, still holding Camilla's gloved hand raised for the room to see, turned his head and found her standing there. For one long moment, no one moved. Eleanor watched the color drain from his face. She watched his mouth part as though he meant to speak her name, though no sound came. She watched Camilla's confusion turn slowly into understanding, and then into something colder, as the other woman glanced between them, and read the truth written plainly on both their faces. A year ago, in the walled garden behind Hartwell House, Julian had knelt in the grass and asked Eleanor to marry him. He had no ring to give her that night, only a promise, whispered like a vow, that he would return from his business abroad within the year and make her his wife before all of England. Eleanor had waited through 12 months of silence, telling herself that important men had important reasons for their quiet. She had written to him 3 times. She had received nothing in return. And still she had waited, because love asks a person to wait long after sense tells them to stop. Now she understood why the letters had never come. A gentleman near the punch table, unaware of who she was, murmured to his companion that the newcomer looked as though she had seen a ghost. His companion answered that perhaps she had, for the woman's eyes had not left the Duke since she entered, and the Duke's eyes had not left her either. Eleanor forced her spine straight. She would not faint. She would not weep in front of strangers who already whispered behind painted fans. Whatever Julian had done, whatever reason he might offer, she would not give this room the satisfaction of watching Eleanor Ashworth crumble on a marble floor. She took a single step forward, and the crowd parted before her as though she carried some invisible force. Julian released Camilla's hand at last, though he did it slowly, as though his fingers had forgotten how to let go of anything. Camilla did not release her own composure so easily. She lifted her chin, smoothed the front of her gown, and waited with the practiced calm of a woman who had spent her whole life being watched. "Lady Ashworth," Julian said, and his voice cracked faintly on the second word. "I did not expect you tonight." "Clearly," Eleanor answered. Her own voice surprised her with its steadiness. "I received word only this morning that congratulations were in order. I came as quickly as I could, to see for myself whether it was true." A murmur passed through the nearby guests. Someone near the orchestra whispered the word betrothed, and someone else corrected it to almost betrothed, and a third voice, delighted by the drama unfolding before them, simply repeated the word scandal, until it hung in the air like smoke. Camilla stepped forward, placing herself neatly at Julian's side, as though staking a claim that needed no further words. "Forgive me," she said, addressing Eleanor directly, though her eyes flicked once toward Julian with a question he did not answer. "I do not believe we have been introduced." "We have not," Eleanor said, "though it seems we have more in common than an introduction would suggest." Julian's jaw tightened. "Eleanor," he said quietly, using her given name in front of everyone, a slip that told the room more than any confession could have. "Please, let me explain." "Here?" Eleanor asked, and for the first time her composure trembled, though only slightly, only enough for those closest to see it. "In front of your guests? Your bride? Explain what, exactly, Your Grace?" "That you asked me to marry you beneath the pear trees at Hartwell House, and then let a year pass without a single word, only to announce your engagement to someone else the very night I finally received news of you." The silence that followed was absolute. Even the musicians, who had begun to lift their instruments again, lowered them once more. Camilla's composure cracked for the briefest instant, a flicker of genuine surprise crossing her face before she smoothed it away. She looked at Julian with new eyes, as though seeing something she had not seen before, though whether it was hurt or calculation, Eleanor could not tell. "That is not the whole truth," Julian said, his voice low and urgent now. meant only for her, though half the room strained to hear it anyway. There are things you do not understand. Things I could not put in a letter. Then perhaps you might have found a way to visit, Eleanor said. Or to send word through someone other than silence. A woman near the wall, dressed in deep green and watching with sharp, assessing eyes, stepped closer to the unfolding scene. This was Margaret Hartwell, Julian's younger sister, and she alone in that crowded room did not look surprised. She looked, if anything, as though she had been waiting a long while for exactly this moment to arrive. "Julian," Margaret said, her voice carrying easily across the sudden quiet. "Perhaps this conversation belongs somewhere with fewer witnesses." "There is no conversation to be had," Camilla said, recovering her voice at last, though it came out thinner than before. "Julian and I are engaged. Whatever history exists between him and Lady Ashworth is precisely that. History." Eleanor turned to look at her properly for the first time. Camilla Voss was younger than she had expected, and there was something in her face, beneath the practiced poise, that looked almost frightened. Eleanor understood, with a strange and sudden clarity, that Camilla had not known. Whatever cruelty existed in tonight's events, it did not belong entirely to the woman standing beside Julian. It belonged to Julian himself, and to whatever secret he had kept buried for a year. "I am sorry," Eleanor said, and she meant it, speaking now only to Camilla. "You do not deserve to learn of this in front of a crowded room, and neither, I suppose, did I deserve to learn of your engagement the same way. It seems we have both been poorly served tonight." She turned back to Julian, and something in her chest, some final thread of hope she had carried across 2 counties, finally gave way and let go. "I will not make a scene of myself further," she said. "You have made your announcement, Your Grace. I wish you joy of it." She turned to leave, her cloak swinging heavy with road dust behind her, and the crowd parted again to let her pass, whispering already, the story of tonight beginning to spread through the ballroom before she had even reached the door. "Eleanor, wait." Julian's voice broke through the murmurs, raw enough that several guests turned to stare at him instead of her. He took a step to follow, but Camilla's hand closed around his sleeve, not gently, and he stopped. "You cannot chase after her," Camilla said quietly, though her eyes were bright with something sharper than sorrow. "Not tonight, not in front of everyone. Think, Julian, of what is at stake." Julian looked from Camilla's hand on his sleeve to Eleanor's retreating back, and for a moment he seemed a man caught between 2 currents, unable to swim toward either shore. Eleanor did not look back. She walked the length of the ballroom with her chin lifted, past the whispering guests and the astonished faces, past the orchestra that had finally begun to play again in a desperate attempt to smooth over the scandal, and out through the same doors she had entered only minutes before. The night air outside was sharp and cold, and Eleanor stood on the front steps of Hartwell House, breathing it in, willing her hands to stop shaking. Behind her, through the tall windows, she could see the golden light of the ballroom, the shapes of dancers beginning to move again, the whole glittering world she had once hoped to belong to. She did not yet know that Julian had spent the last year buried in debts he had told no one about, not even his own sister. She did not know that his silence had not been cruelty, but shame, the particular shame of a proud man watching his family's name crumble around him. She did not know that the letters he had written to her, dozens of them, sat locked in a drawer in his study, never sent, because he had believed himself unworthy of her the moment his fortune began to fail. All she knew, standing alone on the cold stone steps while laughter and music spilled out behind her, was that the man she loved had chosen another woman, and that whatever reason he might give for it, the wound of tonight would not heal easily. A carriage stood waiting at the bottom of the drive. Eleanor gathered what remained of her courage, walked down to meet it, and did not once look back at the house glowing gold behind her, though every step away from it felt like leaving a piece of herself behind on the marble floor where Julian Hartwell had once knelt in a garden and promised her forever. The driver, an older man who had carried her family for years, took one look at her face and asked no questions. He simply helped her into the carriage and closed the door softly, as though he understood that silence was the only kindness left to offer. Eleanor sat back against the worn leather seat and pressed her gloved hands together in her lap, trying to steady her breathing as the wheels began to turn beneath her. Through the small window she watched Hartwell House grow smaller, its windows glowing like a row of watchful eyes, until a bend in the road hid it from view entirely. Only then did she allow herself a single unsteady breath, though she refused, even in the privacy of the carriage, to let the tears rise further than the edge of her lashes. She thought of the letter that had brought her here, the hurried scrawl of her cousin's handwriting warning her that the whole county spoke of nothing but the Duke's coming engagement. She thought of the year of silence before it, The 3 letters she had sent that received no answer, the quiet hope she had nursed through every long month that something, anything, might explain his absence. She had imagined illness. She had imagined delay. She had never once imagined this. The carriage rattled on through the dark countryside, carrying her away from the golden windows and the whispering crowd, and Eleanor closed her eyes, wondering how a single evening could unmake a year of waiting so completely, and wondering, too, whether any explanation Julian might one day offer could ever be enough to mend what had broken tonight. Inside, the ballroom slowly returned to its rhythm, though the guests would speak of little else for weeks to come. Margaret Hartwell watched her brother stand frozen at the center of the room, Camilla's hand still gripping his sleeve, his eyes fixed on the doors through which Eleanor had disappeared, and she understood, better than anyone else present, that tonight was only the beginning of a much longer story. Julian Hartwell did not sleep that night. He sat alone in his study long after the last carriage had rolled away from Hartwell House, staring at a drawer he had not opened in months, knowing exactly what it contained and unable to bring himself to look inside. The ballroom below had emptied hours ago, though the scent of crushed flowers and spent candles still drifted up through the floorboards, a reminder of the evening he could not undo. Camilla had left soon after Eleanor, her carriage pulling away with a coldness that promised a difficult conversation to come. His sister Margaret had said nothing to him at all, which frightened him more than any lecture could have. He rose finally and crossed to the drawer, pulling it open with hands that were not quite steady. Inside lay a bundle of letters, more than 30 of them, each addressed to Eleanor Ashworth, each written in his own hand, and not one of them ever sent. The first was dated barely a week after he had left England. He had written it aboard a ship bound for the continent, describing the Greywater and his hope of returning within months with enough resolve to make her his wife properly, without the shadow of his father's failing estate hanging over their future. He had meant to send it the moment he reached port. He never had. The truth, which Julian had told no one, not even his own sister, was that his father had left behind debts so large they threatened to swallow Hartwell House whole. The elder Duke had gambled away portions of the family fortune for years, hiding the losses behind a cheerful public face, and it was only after his death that Julian discovered the full scope of the ruin. Tenant farms stood in danger of being sold. Servants who had worked for the family for decades faced losing their positions. The Hartwell name, respected for 3 generations, stood one poor harvest away from disgrace. Julian had gone abroad not for business, as he had told Eleanor, but to attempt, through a distant relation in shipping trade, to recover some portion of what his father had lost. He had spent the year negotiating, traveling between ports, watching one venture after another collapse beneath him. Each failure had made him more certain that he had nothing left to offer the woman he loved, and each certainty had kept another letter locked in this drawer instead of on its way to her. He had returned to England 3 months ago with his fortune no better secured than when he left, and it was his own solicitor, a practical man named Edmund Caro, who had first suggested the solution that led to tonight's disaster. Camilla Voss came from a family with considerable wealth and no title of their own. A marriage between the 2 houses would resolve the Hartwell debts within a year, and elevate the Voss family's standing in equal measure. It was, Edmund had said plainly, the sensible choice. Julian had agreed to it in a moment of exhaustion and shame, telling himself that Eleanor deserved a husband who could offer her a secure future, not a man drowning in his father's mistakes. He had told himself that walking away from her quietly, without explanation, was a kindness rather than a cruelty. He understood now, sitting alone with 30 unsent letters in his lap, how badly he had misjudged that choice. A knock sounded at the study door, and Margaret entered without waiting for an answer, still dressed in the deep green gown she had worn to the ball. She took one look at the letters spread across his desk and closed the door firmly behind her. "So," she said, "you have been writing to her this entire year." "I could never bring myself to send them," Julian admitted. "What would I have said, Margaret?" "That I loved her, but could offer her nothing but a title attached to a ruined estate." "You might have said the truth," Margaret answered, crossing the room to sit opposite him. "Instead, you let her wait a year for word that never came, and then let her learn of your engagement by walking into a ballroom uninvited. Do you understand what you have done to her?" Julian pressed his palms against his eyes. "I understand it better with every hour that passes." "And Camilla?" Margaret asked. "Does she understand any of this?" "She does not," Julian said. "She believes our engagement to be a practical arrangement between 2 families who respect each other. She does not know that my heart was given away long before I ever proposed to her." Margaret studied him for a long moment. "Then you have wronged 2 women in a single evening, Julian, not one." Camilla deserves better than to be a solution to your family's debts, just as Eleanor deserved better than to be abandoned in silence. Her words landed with the weight of truth, and Julian said nothing, because there was nothing to say in his own defense. Across the county that same night, Eleanor sat awake in the small guest room of her cousin's house, still wearing her travel-worn dress, unable to bring herself to change into nightclothes as though changing would mean accepting that the night was truly over. Her cousin, a gentlewoman named Charlotte, sat beside her with a cup of untouched tea between them. "You do not have to speak of it tonight," Charlotte said softly. "I keep thinking of the letters I sent him," Eleanor said, staring at the small fire in the grate. 3 of them, over the course of the year. "I told myself he was simply too occupied with business to answer. I never once considered that he had chosen someone else and simply lacked the courage to tell me." "Perhaps there is more to it than that," Charlotte offered carefully. "Perhaps," Eleanor said, though her voice held little conviction. "But whatever the reason, Charlotte, he let me learn it in front of 300 strangers. Whatever explanation he might offer now cannot undo that." She fell silent, watching the fire burn low, and Charlotte did not press her further, understanding that some wounds needed quiet before they could bear examination. The following morning, word of the ballroom scene had already begun spreading through the county, carried by servants and guests alike, growing more dramatic with each retelling. By midday, Camilla Voss arrived at Hartwell House unannounced, her carriage pulling up the drive with a sharpness that suggested her patience had already worn thin. Julian met her in the same study where he had spent the night among his unsent letters, though he had cleared the desk before her arrival, unwilling to let her see the full evidence of what he had kept from her. "I want the truth," Camilla said, without preamble, seating herself across from him with rigid composure. "All of it, Julian. Not the version you gave me when you proposed, and not whatever softened account you might be tempted to offer now." Julian studied her for a long moment, weighing how much to reveal, and then decided, for perhaps the first time in a year, to choose honesty over convenience. "I loved her before I ever met you," he said. "I asked her to marry me more than a year ago, in the garden behind this very house. I left for the continent soon after, meaning to secure our future, and instead discovered the full extent of my father's debts. I could not bear to return to her with nothing to offer, so I said nothing at all. When Edmund suggested our arrangement, I told myself it was the responsible choice for my family's sake. I did not tell you the truth because I did not wish to lose the one solution that seemed to save Hartwell House from ruin." Camilla's face remained carefully still throughout his account, though her hands, folded tightly in her lap, betrayed the effort it cost her to hold that stillness. "So I am not your choice," she said finally. "I am your rescue. That is not fair to either of us," Julian said. "I have great respect for you, Camilla. I believed, and still believe, that we might have built a good life together." "Respect," Camilla repeated, the word landing flat and cold in the quiet room. "You asked me to marry you while writing letters to another woman you never had the courage to send. Do you understand how that sounds? Spoken aloud in a room with no ballroom crowd to soften it?" Julian had no answer for her, and his silence, more than any words could have, confirmed everything she already suspected. Camilla rose from her chair, smoothing the front of her gown with hands that trembled only slightly. "I will need time to consider what comes next," she said. "But know this, Julian, whatever happens between you and Lady Ashworth, I will not stand quietly by and be made a fool of twice in 1 week. If our engagement continues, it will be on my terms, and if it ends, it will end the same way it began, in front of everyone who witnessed its beginning." She left without waiting for his reply, and Julian sat alone once more in his study, surrounded by the wreckage of choices he could no longer undo, understanding at last that the coming weeks would demand more honesty from him than he had shown in the entire year before. That afternoon, Margaret found him still seated at his desk, the untouched letters pushed to one side, his eyes fixed on nothing in particular. She did not ask how the conversation with Camilla had gone. His expression told her enough. "You look like a man who has finally understood the size of the hole he has dug," she said, settling into the chair across from him without waiting for an invitation. "I have made a mess of everything," Julian admitted. "Camilla is right to be furious with me. Eleanor is right to want nothing more to do with me. I have spent a year protecting my pride instead of telling either woman the truth, and now I have hurt them both in a single evening." "Then stop protecting your pride," Margaret said simply. "It is rather too late for that particular strategy to serve you well." Julian looked up at her. "What would you have me do?" "First," Margaret said, counting on her fingers with the brisk efficiency she brought to every problem, "you will let Camilla decide what she wishes to do with your engagement, without pressing her one way or the other. She has earned that much honesty, at the very least. Second, You will stop hiding those letters in a drawer as though they mean nothing. If they mean something, Eleanor deserves to read them, whatever she decides to do afterward. And third, you will stop treating our family's debts as a secret to be managed alone. Edmund Caro is not the only man in England who understands finance, Julian. I have eyes and a mind of my own, and I might have helped you find a solution that did not require marrying a stranger for her fortune. Julian managed a tired, humorless laugh. You make it sound simple. It is not simple, Margaret said, her voice softening slightly. But it is far simpler than the mess you have made trying to avoid it. He considered her words for a long moment, turning the bundle of letters over in his hands. I do not know if Eleanor will even agree to see me again. Then you will have to earn the chance, Margaret said. Words alone will not be enough this time, Julian. Not after what she witnessed last night. You will have to show her, through actions she can trust, that you are not the same man who let a year pass in silence. Meanwhile, across the county, news of the scandal continued to spread through drawing rooms and market squares alike. By the second morning, Eleanor could not walk into the village without catching the sideways glances of shopkeepers and the hushed whispers of women gathered near the church steps. Charlotte, ever protective of her cousin, suggested they remain at home until the gossip cooled, but Eleanor refused. I will not hide as though I have done something shameful, she said, tying the ribbons of her bonnet with steady hands. Julian made his choice in front of everyone. I intend to walk through this village with my head held just as high as it was on that ballroom floor. They walked together to the market, and though Eleanor felt every eye upon her, she kept her pace even, and her expression composed. It was there, near the baker's stall, that she encountered Margaret Hartwell for the first time since the ball. Margaret approached without hesitation, ignoring the curious stares of nearby villagers. Lady Ashworth, she said with a small, respectful bow of her head. I wondered if I might speak with you, if you would permit it. Eleanor stiffened, unsure what to expect from the sister of the man who had humiliated her so publicly. I cannot imagine what we might have to discuss, Miss Hartwell. Perhaps only this, Margaret said. I do not know the full truth of what passed between you and my brother, but I know enough to say that his silence this past year was not the silence of a man who had stopped caring. I have watched him grieve something for 12 months without understanding what it was, until 2 nights ago. I do not say this to excuse him. I say it only because I think you deserve to know that the man who wronged you is also a man who has wronged himself, quite thoroughly, in the process. Eleanor studied her carefully, searching for some hidden motive behind the words, but found only quiet sincerity in Margaret's expression. Why tell me this? Because I believe you deserve the whole truth eventually, Margaret said. Whether you choose to hear it from Julian or not is entirely your own decision. But I did not wish you to walk through this village believing yourself entirely alone in your anger. Whatever my brother has done, I am not blind to the wrong of it. She took her leave before Eleanor could respond further, and Charlotte watched the exchange with quiet curiosity as the two women parted ways. That was unexpected, Charlotte murmured once Margaret was out of earshot. It was, Eleanor agreed, though she found herself turning the words over in her mind for the rest of the day, wondering what truth Margaret had spoken of, and whether she truly wished to learn it. That evening, as Eleanor sat once more by the small fire in Charlotte's guest room, a letter arrived by messenger, addressed in a hand she recognized instantly. She stared at it for a long while before breaking the seal, her heart beating faster than she wished to admit. The letter was brief, far shorter than she expected from a man who had once written her poetry beneath the pear trees of Hartwell House. I do not ask for your forgiveness, the letter read. I have not earned it, and I will not pretend otherwise. I ask only for the chance to explain myself honestly, in whatever way and whatever place you find acceptable. If you refuse, I will trouble you no further. But if there is any part of you still willing to hear the truth, I will be waiting at the old stone bridge tomorrow at noon, as I once waited there for you before, though this time I understand fully that I have no right to expect you to come. Eleanor read the letter 3 times before folding it carefully and setting it aside. Charlotte, watching her cousin's face for some sign of what the letter contained, asked gently whether she meant to answer it. I do not know, Eleanor admitted. Part of me wishes to burn it and be done with him entirely. And part of me, she paused, staring into the dying fire, part of me still wishes to understand why a man who once knelt in a garden and promised me forever could let an entire year pass without a single word. She did not sleep well that night, turning the letter's words over and over in her mind, torn between the wound that still throbbed raw within her and the small, stubborn hope that refused, despite everything, to die completely. The old stone bridge had not changed in a year, though everything else between them had. Eleanor stood at its center, watching the water pass beneath in slow, restless currents, and wondered whether coming here at all had been a mistake. She had not decided until the very last moment. She had dressed, undressed, and dressed again 3 times that morning, unable to settle on whether she wished to appear as though the past year had wounded her deeply, or as though it had not touched her at all. In the end, she wore a plain gray dress and left her hair simply pinned, deciding that vanity had no place in a conversation that might finally reveal the truth she had waited a year to hear. Julian arrived precisely at noon, and Eleanor noted, despite herself, that he looked as though he had slept as little as she had. There were shadows beneath his eyes that had not been there 2 nights ago, and his usual composure, the easy confidence that had once drawn half the county's attention wherever he walked, had been replaced by something rawer and far less certain. "You came," he said, stopping several paces away, as though afraid that closing the distance too quickly might frighten her off entirely. "I nearly did not," Eleanor answered honestly. "I am still uncertain whether I have made the right choice in coming." "Then let me not waste the chance you have given me." Julian drew a folded bundle of papers from beneath his coat, tied with plain string, and held it out toward her. "Before I say anything else, I want you to have these. You may read them now, or later, or never at all, but I could not stand before you today without giving them to you first." Eleanor took the bundle cautiously, untying the string with careful fingers. Inside lay letter after letter, dozens of them, each addressed to her in Julian's familiar hand, each dated across the span of the past year, and not one of them bearing the marks of having ever been sent. "You wrote all of these?" she asked, disbelief coloring her voice as she flipped through page after page of his handwriting. "Every week, sometimes more," Julian said. "I began the first one aboard the ship that carried me away from England, and I could not seem to stop, even long after I understood I would never send them." Eleanor opened the letter nearest the top of the bundle and began to read, her eyes moving quickly across lines that described a gray sea and a heart already homesick for a garden he had left behind. She read another, dated 3 months later, describing failed negotiations and a growing shame he could not shake. She read a third, shorter than the others, written in a hand that trembled slightly across the page, admitting that he no longer believed himself worthy of the promise he had made her. "Why?" she asked finally, looking up at him with eyes bright with unshed tears she refused to let fall. "Why write all this and never send a single word of it? Do you understand what this past year has been for me, Julian? I waited. I told myself every excuse a hopeful woman could invent. I defended your silence to my own family when they questioned it. And all the while you were writing to me, every week, and simply choosing not to let me know it. Because I could not bear for you to read what I had become," Julian said, his voice rough with an honesty he had denied himself for far too long. "My father left behind debts large enough to threaten everything the Hartwell name has stood for across 3 generations. I went abroad believing I could resolve them quietly, quickly, before you ever had to know how close to ruin we stood. Every failed venture made me more certain that I had nothing left worth offering you. I told myself that silence was mercy. I understand now how wrong I was." Eleanor stared down at the letters in her hands, the weight of an entire year's unspoken words pressing suddenly heavy against her chest. "You should have trusted me enough to tell me the truth, whatever it was. I did not fall in love with your fortune, Julian. I fell in love with you." "I know that now," Julian said. "I knew it, somewhere, even then. But shame is a poor advisor, and I let it guide me for far too long." They stood in silence for a long moment, the water continuing its slow passage beneath the bridge, neither quite ready to close the distance still between them. "And Camilla?" Eleanor asked finally. "What of her in all of this?" Julian's expression grew heavier still. "She deserves better than what I have given her. Our engagement was born of my solicitor's practical suggestion and my own desperation to save my family's name. I told her, 2 days ago, the whole truth of it. She has asked for time to decide what she wishes to do." "Then you have wronged us both," Eleanor said quietly, echoing, though she did not know it, the very words Margaret had spoken to him days before. "I have," Julian admitted, "and I do not ask you to forgive it easily, or quickly, or at all if you find you cannot. I ask only that you know the truth, whatever you choose to do with it." Eleanor tied the string back around the bundle of letters, holding them against her chest as though uncertain whether to keep them or return them to him. "I need time, Julian, time to read these properly, alone, and time to understand what I feel now that I know the truth. A year of silence cannot be undone in a single conversation on a bridge." "I understand," Julian said, though the words cost him visibly. I will not press you further than you are willing to give. But I will be here, whenever you are ready to speak again, for however long that takes." Eleanor nodded once, turned, and began the walk back toward Charlotte's house, the bundle of letters heavy in her arms, though not nearly so heavy as the year of doubt they had finally begun to explain. Word of their meeting at the bridge reached Camilla within a day, carried by a servant who had recognized Eleanor's carriage on the road. Camilla received the news in the drawing room of her family's townhouse, seated across from her mother, who had spent the past 2 days urging her daughter to salvage the engagement regardless of whatever scandal surrounded it. "You cannot simply release a duke over a matter of wounded pride," her mother said sharply. "Think of what this match means for our family's standing. Think of what it means for your own future." "I have thought of little else," Camilla replied, though her voice carried an edge her mother did not often hear from her. "But I will not spend my life married to a man who loves someone else, mother, whatever standing it might buy us." I watched his face the moment Eleanor Ashworth walked into that ballroom. I have never once seen him look at me the way he looked at her. Her mother's expression tightened with frustration. "Love is a luxury, Camilla. Security is not. You would be wise to remember which one actually protects a woman across a lifetime." Camilla rose from her chair and walked to the window, looking out over the quiet street below. "Perhaps you are right, mother. Perhaps security matters more than affection in the long course of a marriage. But I refuse to be someone's rescue when I might instead be someone's choice. I would rather face uncertainty honestly than comfort built on a lie." Her mother said nothing further, though her disapproval remained plain upon her face, and Camilla stood alone at the window for a long while afterward, weighing a decision that would soon reshape more lives than her own. Meanwhile, at Hartwell House, Margaret found her brother in the garden behind the great house, standing near the very pear trees where he had once proposed to Eleanor a year before. He held no letter in his hands this time, only the quiet weight of a conversation he had finally been brave enough to have. "You gave her the letters," Margaret said, joining him beneath the trees. "I did." "And what did she say?" "That she needs time," Julian answered, "which is more than I deserve, and less than I hoped for, in equal measure." Margaret studied her brother's face, noting the mixture of relief and dread written plainly across it. "Then you will give her that time, and you will use it wisely. Prove to her, Julian, through your actions rather than your words, that you have changed. Anyone can write pretty letters when the danger of sending them has already passed. Show her instead that you are willing to fight honestly for what remains of this chance, rather than hiding behind pride the way you did before." "How do I do that?" Julian asked quietly, "when I have already broken every promise that once meant something between us?" "You start," Margaret said, "by fixing the very thing you tried to hide from her in the first place. Solve the debts honestly, Julian, without marrying your way out of them. Show her, and show Camilla, and show this entire county if you must, that you are capable of rebuilding something without sacrificing another person's heart to do it." Julian considered his sister's words for a long while, watching the afternoon light filter down through the pear tree branches above them, and for the first time since the disastrous evening of the ball, he felt something close to a plan beginning to form, however uncertain its outcome might still be. Before Eleanor reached her candle that night, Charlotte knocked softly and let herself into the room, carrying a small tray of tea neither of them would likely drink. She sat at the foot of the bed and watched her cousin sort the letters into careful chronological piles across the coverlet. "You have read nearly all of them," Charlotte observed. "I could not stop myself," Eleanor admitted. "Each one explains a little more than the last. It is strange, Charlotte, to feel my anger and my sympathy growing side by side, as though they cannot decide which of them ought to win." "Perhaps they need not fight each other at all," Charlotte suggested gently. "A person can be angry and still understand the reasons behind what wounded them. The two are not opposites, whatever we are taught to believe." Eleanor considered this, smoothing her hand over the topmost letter, dated only a month before Julian's return to England. "He believed himself unworthy of me the moment his fortune began to fail, as though love were a transaction rather than a promise, as though I would have valued him less for honesty than I now value him for silence." "Men are taught strange lessons about pride," Charlotte said. "My own husband once refused to tell me our household accounts were short for nearly half a year, convinced I would think less of him for it. I did not think less of him at all. I thought less of him only when I discovered he had hidden it." "That is precisely it," Eleanor said, setting the letters aside at last. "I could have forgiven struggle. I could have forgiven failure. What I struggle now to forgive is the silence itself, the choice to let me wait in ignorance rather than trust me with the truth." Charlotte reached over and squeezed her cousin's hand. "Then that is the question you must answer for yourself. In whatever time you need, not whether you can forgive his debts or his pride, but whether you believe he has truly learned to choose honesty over silence going forward. A man's past mistakes matter less than the proof of his changed direction. Eleanor nodded slowly, turning the words over in her mind long after Charlotte had taken the untouched tea and left her alone once more. The following days brought little peace to either household. In the village, the scandal continued to ripple outward, reaching ears far beyond the immediate circle of guests who had witnessed it firsthand. A traveling merchant carried the story to the next county over, embellishing it with details that bore little resemblance to the actual events, until whispers reached Eleanor's own family estate that she had fainted dramatically in the ballroom, or that Camilla had struck her across the face, or any number of other inventions that made for livelier gossip than the quieter, sadder truth. Eleanor's father, a reserved man named Henry Ashworth who rarely involved himself in matters of the heart, traveled to Charlotte's house upon hearing the rumors, concerned for his daughter's reputation as much as her well-being. "I have heard a dozen different versions of what happened at that ball," he said, seating himself stiffly in Charlotte's parlor. "I would prefer to hear the truth from you directly, Eleanor, rather than continue guessing which parts the gossips have invented." Eleanor recounted the evening plainly, without embellishment, watching her father's expression shift from concern to quiet anger as she spoke of Julian's silence and Camilla's engagement announcement. "And now he has given you letters," her father said, once she finished, as though paper alone might undo a year of silence. "They explain a great deal, father, his family's debts, his shame, the reasons behind his silence. I do not say they excuse it entirely, but I understand it better now than I did 2 nights ago." Henry Ashworth studied his daughter carefully, his stern expression softening only slightly. "I will not tell you what to feel, Eleanor. You are a grown woman, and this heart is your own to guard, or to give as you see fit. But I will say this. A man who hides the truth once, out of shame, or pride, or fear, may find it easier to hide it again the next time trouble arrives. Watch his actions closely in the weeks to come, not merely his words. Words are cheap when a man has already proven himself capable of silence." "I intend to," Eleanor said quietly. "Whatever I decide, father, I will not decide it quickly, nor will I decide it based on pretty apologies alone." Her father seemed satisfied with this answer, though he lingered a while longer, speaking of practical matters, of the family estate and the coming harvest, allowing the conversation to drift gently away from the ache still sitting heavy in his daughter's chest. Across the county, Camilla faced pressures of her own kind. Her mother continued to press the case for maintaining the engagement despite everything, while her father, a quieter and more thoughtful man, took his daughter aside one evening and asked her plainly what she herself wished for, apart from any consideration of family standing or fortune. "I wish," Camilla said slowly, surprised by how easily the words came once someone finally asked the right question, "to be loved as completely as Julian Hartwell once loved Eleanor Ashworth beneath those pear trees. I do not believe I will find that with him, father, whatever comfort his title might otherwise provide." Her father nodded, unsurprised by her answer. "Then you already know what you must do, Camilla, even if the doing of it frightens you." "It does frighten me," she admitted. "Ending this engagement means facing the same gossip that has already humiliated me once. It means admitting, publicly, that the match has failed." "Better to admit it now," her father said gently, "than to spend a lifetime pretending a mistake was a triumph. Pride recovers, Camilla. Wasted years do not." She sat with his words long into the evening, watching the candle burn low, weighing the safety of a title against the honesty of walking away from a man who had never truly chosen her at all. Later that night, unable to settle her thoughts enough for sleep, Camilla walked out into the garden behind her family's townhouse, wrapping a shawl tightly around her shoulders against the evening chill. The stars overhead seemed indifferent to the turmoil below them, and she found some strange comfort in that indifference, as though the vastness of the sky made her own troubles smaller and easier to bear. She thought of the moment Eleanor had walked into the ballroom, the way the whole room had turned as one, the way Julian's face had changed the instant their eyes met. She had told herself, in the days since, that jealousy alone explained the anger she felt. But walking alone beneath the stars, she recognized something closer to relief hiding beneath that anger, relief that the truth had surfaced before the wedding, rather than after, relief that she had not spent years discovering slowly what she now understood clearly, in a single painful evening. By the time she returned indoors, her decision had settled within her, quiet and certain, though she resolved to give it a few more days before speaking it aloud, wanting to be certain her choice came from clarity, rather than wounded pride alone. A week passed before Eleanor sent word to Julian again, And when the message finally arrived at Hartwell House, it came not as a letter, but as a simple line delivered by messenger, asking him to meet her at Charlotte's house the following afternoon. Julian arrived early, pacing the small front garden for nearly 20 minutes before he trusted himself to knock. Charlotte answered the door and led him into the parlor without a word, her expression giving nothing away, and left him alone to wait for Eleanor's arrival. When Eleanor entered, she carried herself differently than she had at the bridge. There was less rawness in her posture now, replaced by something steadier, though no less guarded. She sat across from him and folded her hands in her lap before speaking. "I have read every letter," she said. "Some of them more than once." "And what have you decided?" Julian asked, unable to keep the anxious edge from his voice. "I have decided that I understand why you did what you did," Eleanor said carefully. "I do not agree with it, and I do not think it was right. But I understand the fear that drove it, and I understand, better now than I did a week ago, that shame can make even good men choose poorly." Julian exhaled slowly, though relief did not fully settle over him, sensing there was more to come. "But understanding is not the same as trust," Eleanor continued. "You hid an entire year of struggle from me, because you feared how I would see you. What assurance do I have that you would not do the same again, the next time trouble finds you? Marriage is built on more than affection, Julian. It requires honesty, even when honesty is difficult, especially when it is difficult." "I know that now," Julian said. "I learned it at great cost, and I do not expect you to simply take my word for it. I only ask for the chance to prove it, through my actions rather than my promises." Eleanor studied him for a long moment. "Then prove it. Not to me first, but to yourself. Solve your family's debts honestly, Julian, without hiding behind another marriage of convenience. Show me, and show this entire county, that you are capable of facing hardship openly, rather than retreating into silence." "And if I do?" Julian asked quietly. "What then, Eleanor?" "Then we will speak again," she said, "and I will listen with a more open heart than I can currently offer. But I will not promise you more than that today. I have been wounded once by promises made beneath these very circumstances. I will not be so quick to trust another." Julian nodded, accepting the terms she offered, understanding that they were more generous than he had any right to expect. He rose to leave, pausing at the parlor door. "Thank you," he said, "for reading the letters, for giving me even this much of a chance." "Do not thank me yet," Eleanor said. "Thank me only if you prove worthy of it." He left with those words settled heavily in his chest, and Eleanor sat alone in the parlor for a long while afterward, wondering whether she had just made the wisest decision of her life, or the most foolish one. 3 days later, Camilla requested a private meeting with Julian at Hartwell House, and this time it was Julian who waited anxiously in his study while she was announced. She entered composed and steady, none of the earlier fury visible in her bearing, replaced instead by a calm resolve that unsettled him more than her anger had. "I have made my decision," she said, seating herself across from him without preamble. "I release you from our engagement, Julian, fully and without condition." Julian stared at her, surprised, despite having half expected this outcome. "Camilla, Let me finish," she said, raising a hand gently. "I do not do this out of spite, nor out of any wish to punish you for what happened. I do it because I have realized, these past days, that I deserve a marriage built on choice rather than convenience. You did not choose me, Julian. You chose a solution to a problem, and I happened to be standing nearby when you needed one. I will not spend my life as someone's rescue when I might instead wait for someone's true choice." "You deserve far better than what I offered you," Julian admitted. "I am sorry, Camilla, for the position I placed you in." "I accept your apology," she said, "though I do not need it as much as you might think. I have learned something valuable from this entire ordeal, even if the lesson arrived at an uncomfortable cost. I intend to wait now, patiently, for a man who sees me clearly from the very beginning, rather than one who settles for me because circumstance leaves him little other choice." Julian inclined his head respectfully. "I hope you find exactly that, Camilla. You deserve nothing less." She rose to leave, pausing at the study door much as Julian had paused at Charlotte's parlor days before. "For what it is worth," she said, "I hope Eleanor forgives you eventually. Whatever your faults, I do not believe you are a cruel man, Julian, only a frightened one who mistook silence for protection. I hope you have learned, as I have, that honesty serves everyone better in the end." She left Hartwell House that afternoon, and word of the broken engagement spread through the county nearly as quickly as news of the ballroom scandal had. Some whispered that Camilla had been cast aside in favor of Eleanor's return. Others, closer to the truth, understood that Camilla herself had chosen to walk away, refusing to remain in a match built on convenience rather than genuine affection. Margaret arrived at the study soon after Camilla's departure, having heard the news already from a servant stationed near the front hall. "She released you," Margaret said, more statement than question. "She did," Julian confirmed, "freely, and with more grace than I deserved from her." "Then the path forward is clearer now," Margaret said, settling into the chair Camilla had just vacated. "No more entanglements standing between you and whatever future you hope to build with Eleanor. Only your own actions left to prove yourself worthy of it." "Eleanor asked me to solve our family's debts honestly," Julian said, "without hiding behind another convenient marriage. I confess, Margaret, I am not entirely certain how to accomplish that without the very solution I have just released." Margaret considered this for a moment, then rose and crossed to the shelf where their father's old ledgers still sat, gathering dust since his death. "Then let us look at the actual numbers together, Julian, rather than the panic that has clouded your judgment for the past year. I have some understanding of finance, whatever assumptions you and Edmund Caro may have made about my capabilities. Perhaps between the two of us, we might find a solution neither of you considered." Over the following days, Julian and Margaret pored over the estate's finances together, uncovering details that Edmund Caro's hurried assessments had overlooked. Several tenant farms, long assumed lost to debt, still held modest value if managed more carefully. A distant shipping investment, one of the ventures Julian had pursued abroad, showed signs of recovering rather than collapsing entirely, provided someone remained to oversee it properly rather than abandoning it in despair. And the Hartwell name itself, tarnished though it was by recent gossip, still carried enough weight in certain circles to secure a reasonable loan, provided Julian was willing to be transparent about the estate's true condition rather than concealing it as his father once had. "It will not be easy," Margaret cautioned, closing the last ledger after nearly a week of careful review. "It will require years of disciplined management, not months. But it is possible, Julian, without selling yourself into another convenient marriage to accomplish it." "Years," Julian repeated, considering the weight of that word. "Eleanor may not wait years to see whether I have truly changed." "Then show her the beginning of the effort," Margaret said, "and let your consistency, rather than the speed of your success, be the proof she asked for. A man who begins honest work, and continues it, steadily says more about his character than a man who solves everything overnight through convenient shortcuts." Julian took his sister's counsel seriously, and within days he had written to the distant relation overseeing the shipping venture, requesting a full and honest account of its current standing, along with his own renewed involvement in its management going forward. He approached the bank holding his family's remaining credit not with excuses, but with a full and transparent accounting of the estate's debts, requesting terms based on the reality of the situation, rather than the polished appearance his father had once maintained. Word of his efforts, quieter and less dramatic than the ballroom scandal that had started it all, began nonetheless to filter through the county in the weeks that followed. Eleanor heard of it first from Charlotte, who had heard it from a servant, who had heard it from someone employed at the bank Julian now visited with regularity. "They say he goes himself now," Charlotte reported one evening, rather than sending Edmund Caro to handle matters quietly on his behalf. "They say he has been entirely honest about the estate's condition, even when honesty cost him easier terms than concealment might have offered." Eleanor listened to this news with a cautious hope she did not yet trust herself to fully embrace. "Actions, not words," she murmured, half to herself, remembering her father's counsel from weeks before. "Let us see whether this continues, Charlotte, before I allow myself to believe it means what I hope it might." But privately, in the quiet of her own room that night, Eleanor allowed herself, for the first time since the disastrous evening of the ball, a small and fragile hope that perhaps the man she had once loved beneath the pear trees was finally becoming the man worthy of that love. Word of Julian's changed conduct did not stay confined to whispers passed between servants for long. Within a fortnight, several of the county's more prominent families began remarking openly on the shift, some with approval and others with the particular suspicion reserved for anyone who dares to behave differently than gossip had already decided they would. At a small gathering hosted by one of the county's oldest families, the topic arose directly, and Julian, rather than deflecting as he once might have, answered questions about his family's finances with a plainness that startled several of the older guests. "You admit, then," one gentleman said, not unkindly but with evident curiosity, "that the estate came closer to ruin than anyone realized?" "I do," Julian answered. "My father managed our affairs poorly in his final years, and I compounded the difficulty by hiding the truth rather than addressing it honestly. I see no benefit now in continuing that same mistake. Better the county knows the truth from me directly than continues inventing its own version through rumor. The honesty, unusual as it was among men of his standing, earned him a grudging respect from several quarters that gossip alone could never have provided. Even those who had once whispered most eagerly about the ballroom scandal found themselves, in the weeks that followed, speaking instead of the Duke's diligent efforts to restore his family's fortune through honest labor, rather than convenient marriage. Margaret noticed the shift most clearly of anyone, watching her brother rise earlier each morning to review ledgers that had once sat gathering dust, watching him ride out personally to inspect the tenant farms, rather than relying solely on his estate manager's reports, watching him write letters in his own hand to the shipping venture's overseer, rather than delegating the correspondence entirely to Edmund Caro. "You have become almost unbearably industrious," she teased him one morning, finding him already at his desk before breakfast had even been served. "I have a great deal to prove," Julian answered, not looking up from the ledger before him. "Not only to Eleanor, though certainly to her most of all. I find I wish to prove it to myself as well, Margaret. I do not care to be the sort of man who hides from difficulty simply because facing it honestly feels uncomfortable." Margaret smiled, though there was warmth beneath the teasing. "Then perhaps some good has come from this entire disaster after all, however painful the path toward it." Meanwhile, Eleanor found herself, almost against her own wishes, paying closer attention to the news that reached her through Charlotte, and through the general gossip of the village. She told herself repeatedly that she remained cautious, that she had not yet decided to forgive him fully, that action sustained over months rather than weeks would be required before she trusted him again completely. And yet she found herself listening more intently than she wished to admit whenever his name arose in conversation, weighing each report of his honest dealings against the wound that still occasionally ached when she thought of the ballroom and the silence that had preceded it. One afternoon, walking through the village with Charlotte, Eleanor passed the bank where Julian had reportedly begun conducting his family's business so openly. Through the window, she caught a brief glimpse of him inside, seated across from an official, his expression serious and attentive, rather than the practiced charm she remembered from years before. He did not see her pass, absorbed as he was in whatever figures lay spread across the desk between them, and Eleanor found herself lingering a moment longer than necessary before continuing on her way. "You watched him rather closely for a woman who claims to remain uncertain," Charlotte observed with the gentle teasing of someone who had known her cousin since childhood. "I am allowed to notice change without immediately trusting it completely," Eleanor replied, though a faint color rose in her cheeks that Charlotte did not fail to notice. "Of course," Charlotte said, smiling to herself as they continued down the lane. "I only observe, Eleanor, that noticing is often where trust quietly begins, whether we intend it to or not." Eleanor said nothing further on the matter, though she thought of it often in the days that followed, watching the county slowly shift its opinion of the Duke who had once humiliated her so publicly, wondering how much longer her own guarded heart could resist the same slow thaw that seemed to be spreading through everyone else around her. 2 months passed before the county gathered again in numbers large enough to rival the night of the original ball, this time for a garden party hosted by the Voss family, ostensibly to celebrate the change of season, though everyone in attendance understood it as an opportunity to observe, at close range, how the county's most talked-about parties would conduct themselves in one another's presence. Eleanor arrived with Charlotte, dressed simply but with more color than she had allowed herself in weeks, a pale yellow that Charlotte had insisted suited her far better than the grays she had favored since the scandal. Camilla, as hostess alongside her parents, moved through the gathered guests with an ease that surprised several onlookers who had expected her to appear diminished by the broken engagement. Instead, she seemed, if anything, lighter than before, laughing freely with old friends and showing particular attention to a quiet, thoughtful gentleman named Andrew Whitfield, newly arrived in the county and evidently taken with her company. Julian arrived later than most, having ridden directly from a meeting with the bank official who now oversaw the terms of his family's restructured debt. He found Margaret near the refreshment table and asked her, quietly, whether Eleanor had yet arrived. "She is near the roses," Margaret said, speaking with Charlotte. "And Julian, before you go to her, I would remind you that a garden party is not the place for grand declarations. Whatever you intend to say it gently, and give her room to answer in her own time." Julian nodded, grateful as always for his sister's steady counsel, and made his way through the gathered guests, toward the rose garden, where Eleanor stood examining a particularly full bloom with more attention than the flower likely warranted. "Lady Ashworth," he said, stopping a respectful distance away. Eleanor turned, and something in her expression, though still guarded, held less of the sharp coldness it had carried in their first conversations after the ball. "Your Grace, I did not expect to see you here. Camilla invited me." Julian said. I believe she wished to demonstrate, to the county at large, that our parting carries no lasting animosity between us. That is generous of her, Eleanor said, given everything. She has been more generous with me than I deserved, Julian agreed. I understand she has taken quite an interest in Mr. Whitfield. Eleanor glanced across the garden to where Camilla stood laughing at something Andrew Whitfield had said, her whole bearing lighter than Eleanor had ever seen it. It seems the ending of your engagement suited her rather well in the end. I hope so, Julian said sincerely. She deserves a man who chooses her fully, not one distracted by another woman's memory. They stood together in a silence that felt less strained than their previous conversations, watching the party continue around them, until Julian spoke again, more carefully this time. I do not wish to press you, Eleanor. I know I promised to prove myself through actions rather than words, and I intend to keep that promise for however long it takes. But I wonder if you might permit me to tell you what progress has been made these past 2 months, so that you need not rely solely on village gossip for your information. Eleanor considered this request, then nodded slowly. I would not mind hearing it directly, I think. They walked together along the garden path as Julian recounted, plainly and without exaggeration, the work of the past weeks. The shipping venture, once assumed a total loss, had begun showing modest returns under his renewed personal oversight. The bank had agreed to restructured terms based on his full transparency about the estate's condition, terms that would require years of careful management, but no longer threatened immediate ruin. 2 of the tenant farms, previously assumed unsalvageable, had been reorganized under new arrangements that benefited both the tenants and the estate alike. It is not finished, Julian admitted as they walked. It will not be finished for years yet. But it is honest work, Eleanor, undertaken openly rather than hidden away in shame. I wished you to know that, whatever else you decide about us, I have at least learned that particular lesson thoroughly. I have heard some of this already, Eleanor admitted, through Charlotte, and through the general talk of the village. I confess I did not expect you to sustain the effort this long. I half expected some new convenient solution to present itself, and tempt you back toward the easier path. There have been temptations, Julian said honestly. A merchant family 2 counties over made discreet inquiries several weeks ago, suggesting their daughter's considerable dowry might resolve matters far more quickly than years of careful management. I declined the inquiry before it progressed any further. Eleanor glanced at him, surprised by this admission. Why tell me this? You might have simply omitted it and let me assume your path forward has been entirely without temptation. Because you asked for honesty, Julian said simply. Not merely the honesty of my successes, but the honesty of my struggles as well. I do not wish to build whatever remains between us on another foundation of convenient omission. Eleanor said nothing for a long moment, absorbing the weight of his words, and Julian, sensing he had perhaps said enough for one conversation, did not press further. They continued walking in companionable quiet until they reached the edge of the garden, where the party's noise faded into the softer sounds of birds settling into the hedgerows for the evening. I am not yet ready to say all that I feel, Eleanor said finally, turning to face him directly. But I will say this much, Julian. I no longer dread the sound of your name the way I did 2 months ago. I find myself, more often than I expected, hoping the reports I hear of your conduct continue to hold true. It was not the declaration Julian had once hoped to hear, but it carried more warmth than any conversation between them since the ballroom, and he accepted it gratefully, understanding that trust, once broken, could not be rushed back into being no matter how eager he was to have it whole again. Their conversation was interrupted by the approach of Andrew Whitfield, who greeted Julian with polite cordiality, before turning his attention to Eleanor with evident interest of his own. Lady Ashworth, he said, Miss Voss speaks highly of your courage these past months. I confess I find myself curious to know the woman behind such resilience. Eleanor smiled politely, though her attention remained partly with Julian even as she engaged Andrew in conversation. Julian, recognizing the moment as his cue to withdraw gracefully, excused himself and made his way back toward Margaret, who watched the entire exchange from a discreet distance with evident interest. How did it go? Margaret asked once he reached her. Better than I expected, Julian said, though not so well that I would call it resolved. She no longer dreads my name, Margaret. That is more progress than I had any right to hope for after 2 months. Patience, Margaret reminded him. You are asking her to rebuild trust that took a single evening to shatter. It will not repair itself in a single garden party, however honest your conversation. Julian nodded, watching from across the garden as Eleanor continued her conversation with Andrew Whitfield, noting with some relief that her attention seemed merely polite rather than particularly captivated, and reminding himself firmly that jealousy, however natural it felt, had no useful place in the careful rebuilding he had undertaken these past months. As the afternoon wore into evening, the garden party began to wind down, guests gathering their things and calling for carriages, the golden light of late afternoon giving way to the softer blue of early evening. Eleanor found herself near the garden's entrance as Julian prepared to depart, and their eyes met once more across the thinning crowd. "Thank you," she said, approaching him briefly before he could mount his horse, "for telling me honestly about the merchant family's inquiry. I know it would have been easier to simply omit it." "Easier," Julian agreed, "but not honest, and I promised you honesty, whatever the cost of it." Eleanor studied him for a long moment, something shifting behind her careful composure. "I find myself wondering, Julian, how long you intend to wait for an answer you cannot yet have." "For as long as it takes," Julian said simply. "I have no right to demand a timeline from you, not after the year of silence I imposed on us both. I will wait, Eleanor, whether that means weeks or months or longer still, because the alternative, giving up on the chance of your forgiveness entirely, is not one I am willing to accept while any possibility remains." Eleanor's expression softened further at this, though she said nothing more, simply nodding once before turning to rejoin Charlotte for their own departure. Julian watched her go, and though the answer he sought remained unspoken, he rode home that evening with a lighter heart than he had carried in months, sensing that whatever remained between them was not yet lost, only patiently waiting for its proper time to bloom fully into the open. That night, as Camilla bid farewell to her final departing guests, Andrew Whitfield lingered a moment longer than the others, thanking her for a lovely afternoon, with evident sincerity in his tone. "I hope you might permit me to call again soon," he said, "if that would be agreeable to you." Camilla smiled, genuine warmth reaching her eyes in a way it rarely had during her engagement to Julian. "I believe that would be very agreeable indeed, Mr. Whitfield." As his carriage pulled away down the drive, Camilla stood a moment longer in the cooling evening air, reflecting on how much had changed since the disastrous night of Julian's announcement, and finding, to her own quiet surprise, that she felt nothing but genuine hope for whatever came next. In the weeks that followed the garden party, a quiet rhythm settled over the county, one far removed from the fevered gossip that had consumed every conversation in the days after the ball. Julian continued his work at the estate with a discipline that surprised even Margaret, rising early each morning to review the shipping accounts himself, riding out to the tenant farms in all weather to oversee the new arrangements personally, rather than trusting reports secondhand. He wrote to Eleanor perhaps once a fortnight, brief notes rather than the long unsent letters of the previous year, describing small progress honestly, rather than grand promises he could not yet guarantee. Eleanor did not always answer these notes quickly, and sometimes she did not answer them at all, but she kept every one of them in a small box beside her bed, and Charlotte noticed, without remarking on it directly, that her cousin read them more than once before setting them aside. One afternoon in early autumn, Eleanor received an unexpected visit from Margaret, who arrived alone, without Julian's knowledge, seeking her out specifically, rather than encountering her by chance, as she had at the market months before. "I hope you will forgive the intrusion," Margaret said, once Charlotte had shown her into the small parlor. "I have not come on my brother's behalf, nor with his knowledge. I have come only as myself, if you will permit me the conversation." "Of course," Eleanor said, curious despite herself. "Please, sit." Margaret settled into the chair across from her, choosing her words with visible care. "I watched my brother grieve for an entire year, Lady Ashworth, without understanding what he grieved, until the night of the ball revealed it plainly. I have watched him these past months work harder than I have ever seen him work at anything, and I do not say this to press you toward a decision you are not ready to make. I say it only because I think, sometimes, we forget to tell people plainly what we observe, and I did not wish to let another season pass without telling you what I have seen." "And what have you seen?" Eleanor asked quietly. "A man who has stopped hiding," Margaret said. "Whatever his faults before, and they were considerable, I do not believe he is hiding anything from you now. I do not ask you to trust my judgment over your own instincts, Lady Ashworth. I ask only that you weigh it as one more piece of evidence, alongside everything else you have observed these past months." Eleanor considered this for a long moment. "I appreciate your honesty, Miss Hartwell, truly. But I hope you understand that this decision, whatever it becomes, must be my own to reach in my own time." "Of course," Margaret said. "I would expect nothing less from a woman who walked into that ballroom with her head held high despite everything arrayed against her that night. I only hope, whatever you decide, that you decide it, because it is what you truly wish, and not because the weight of a year's silence has made you afraid to hope for anything at all." The words lingered with Eleanor long after Margaret's departure, and she found herself, that evening, taking out the small box of Julian's notes and reading through them again, searching not for proof of his sincerity, which she had already begun to believe, but for some clearer sense of her own heart, still guarded despite everything that pointed toward forgiveness. Her father visited again the following week, and finding her thoughtful rather than distressed, asked plainly how matters stood. "I do not know, Father," Eleanor admitted. "I believe he has changed. I believe the evidence of these past months supports that belief. And yet some part of me remains afraid to trust it fully, as though trusting again and being wounded a second time would be a pain I could not survive as easily as the first." Henry Ashworth considered his daughter's words carefully before answering. "There is no promise in this life, Eleanor, that love once given will never wound us again. Even the surest marriages carry risk within them. The question is not whether risk exists, but whether the man before you has shown himself worthy of taking that risk alongside him. From what I have observed these past months, and what I have heard from those whose judgment I trust, Julian Hartwell has worked harder to earn that trust than most men would bother to attempt." "Do you believe I should forgive him then?" Eleanor asked. "I believe," her father said carefully, "that forgiveness and trust are two different gifts, and you may offer one without yet offering the other fully. Forgive him for the pain of that year, Eleanor, for your own sake as much as his, so that the wound does not fester within you regardless of what you decide about the future. Whether you choose to build a life alongside him again is a separate question entirely, one only you can answer, and one you need not rush, simply because the county grows impatient for a conclusion to its favorite scandal." Eleanor took her father's words to heart in the days that followed, and slowly, quietly, without any single dramatic moment marking the change, she found the sharpest edges of her anger beginning to soften into something closer to peace. She did not yet know what she would say when Julian next asked for her answer directly, but she understood, for the first time since the ballroom, that whatever she decided would come from a place of genuine feeling rather than lingering wound alone. One crisp morning, walking alone through the orchard behind her father's house, Eleanor found herself thinking not of the ballroom, nor of the letters, nor even of the long year of silence, but simply of the man Julian had been beneath the pear trees a year and a half ago, before debts and shame and pride had ever come between them. She remembered the particular way he had laughed when nervous, the careful attention he paid to small kindnesses, the steady warmth in his eyes when he looked at her as though she were the only person in any room he had ever entered. She wondered, walking slowly beneath the bare autumn branches, whether that man had ever truly disappeared, or whether he had simply been buried beneath a year of fear he had not known how to carry alone. By the time she returned to the house, her decision had not fully formed itself into words, but something within her had settled, quiet and certain, and she understood that the next time Julian asked for her answer, she would no longer need months to consider it. Hartwell House prepared for its winter ball with far less certainty than it had prepared for the disastrous gathering nearly 6 months before. Margaret oversaw the arrangements this time, since Julian, buried in the final details of the estate's restructured finances, had little attention left for candles and flowers, though he had insisted, against Margaret's initial doubts, that the ballroom be decorated exactly as it had been on the night everything went wrong. "Are you certain," Margaret asked him, 2 days before the event, "that you wish to hold this ball in the very room where the scandal began? Would it not be simpler to choose somewhere new, unburdened by that memory?" "That is precisely why I wish to hold it there," Julian said. "If Eleanor comes tonight, and if she gives me the answer I hope for, I want it spoken in the same room where I once wronged her so publicly. I want the memory of that night replaced by something better, rather than avoided entirely." Margaret studied her brother for a long moment, seeing in him a steadiness she had not witnessed since before their father's death. "You have changed a great deal these past months, Julian." "I hope so," he said quietly. "I have had a great deal of reason to." The shipping venture, after months of careful oversight, had finally begun returning steady profits, enough to satisfy the bank's restructured terms well ahead of the original timeline. The tenant farms, reorganized under fairer arrangements, had produced a strong autumn harvest that eased the estate's immediate pressures considerably. None of it had come through a convenient marriage or a hidden shortcut. All of it had come through months of honest, visible labor, exactly as Eleanor had asked of him. He had sent her an invitation to the winter ball nearly 3 weeks earlier, along with a brief note asking nothing of her beyond her presence, should she wish to attend. He had received no reply, and as the evening of the ball approached, he found himself uncertain whether her silence meant refusal or simply reflected the same careful consideration she had shown throughout the past months. Guests began arriving as the winter sun set early behind the hills, the ballroom filling gradually with the same faces that had witnessed the scandal months before, many of them curious whether tonight might bring some resolution to the story that had occupied the county's gossip for so long. Camilla arrived early, accompanied by Andrew Whitfield, and made her way directly to Julian to offer her genuine well wishes. "I hope tonight brings you what you have worked so hard for," she said, and Julian thanked her sincerely, grateful for the friendship that had somehow grown between them despite everything that had passed. The evening wore on, the orchestra playing, guests dancing across the same marble floor where Eleanor had once stood frozen in the doorway, and still Julian watched the entrance with an anxious hope he could not quite disguise, wondering whether tonight would bring her through those doors again, or whether his months of honest labor had come too late to matter. It was nearing midnight, the crowd beginning to thin as some of the older guests departed, when the doors opened once more and Eleanor stepped through them, dressed not in the travel-worn cloak of 6 months before, but in a deep blue gown that caught the candlelight beautifully as she paused at the threshold. The room did not fall silent this time, the way it had before. The orchestra continued playing, the dancers continued their steps, and only those nearest the door noticed her arrival at first, the memory of the previous scandal apparently softened enough by time that her presence no longer commanded the same dramatic hush. But Julian noticed immediately, crossing the room toward her before he had fully decided to move at all. "You came," he said, echoing the words he had spoken at the stone bridge months before. "I did," Eleanor said, and there was something different in her voice now, a warmth that had been carefully absent from their earlier conversations. "I have heard a great deal these past months, Julian, from Margaret, from Charlotte, from my own father, and most of all from your own letters. I wish to see for myself, tonight, whether the man behind all that honest labor was truly the man I remembered from beneath the pear trees." "And what have you found?" Julian asked, hardly daring to hope. "I have found," Eleanor said, "that I am tired of waiting to trust what my own heart has already decided months ago." She paused, glancing around the ballroom, at the same marble floor, the same golden candlelight, the same room where everything had once shattered so completely. "I forgave you some time ago, Julian, though I did not tell you so directly. What I have struggled with since is not forgiveness, but courage, the courage to risk this heart again, after watching it broken so publicly." "And tonight?" Julian asked, his voice barely steady. "Tonight," Eleanor said, "I find I have found that courage after all." Julian felt something loosen in his chest that had remained tight for the better part of a year, and without further hesitation, he knelt there on the ballroom floor, exactly as he had once knelt beneath the pear trees, though this time in full view of everyone still gathered in the room. "Eleanor Ashworth," he said, his voice carrying clearly across the hushed space that had gathered around them once word spread of what was unfolding. "I cannot undo the silence of that year, nor the pain of the night you walked through those doors and found me announcing my engagement to another. I can only promise you, before everyone gathered here tonight, that I will never again choose silence over honesty, whatever difficulty the future might bring. I love you, as completely as I loved you beneath those pear trees, and more deeply still for having nearly lost you through my own foolish pride. Will you marry me, properly and publicly this time, with nothing hidden between us?" The ballroom, which had grown quiet as the scene unfolded, seemed to hold its collective breath, guests who had witnessed the scandal 6 months before, now witnessing something entirely different unfolding in its place. Eleanor looked down at him, at the man who had once wronged her so deeply and had spent the following months proving, through patient and honest labor, that he was capable of becoming someone worthy of trust again. She thought of the letters she had read by candlelight, of the conversations at the stone bridge and in Charlotte's small parlor, of the quiet courage it had taken him to admit his failures publicly, rather than continue hiding them. "Yes," she said, and the word carried clearly through the silent ballroom. "Yes, Julian, I will marry you." The room erupted into applause and delighted murmurs, the same guests who had witnessed the scandal now witnessing its resolution, and Julian rose to his feet and drew Eleanor into an embrace that neither of them seemed inclined to end quickly. Margaret, watching from near the orchestra, felt tears rise unexpectedly to her eyes, while Camilla, standing beside Andrew Whitfield, smiled with genuine warmth at the sight of two people finally finding their way back to each other, after everything that had nearly kept them apart. "I told you," Margaret said later that evening, finding Eleanor briefly alone near the refreshment table while Julian accepted congratulations from a cluster of well-wishers, "that my brother was not the same man who let a year pass in silence." "You did," Eleanor agreed, smiling, "though I confess I needed to witness it for myself before I could fully believe it. That is only wisdom, Margaret said. I would think less of you had you simply taken my word for it without demanding proof of your own. Eleanor laughed, a genuine, unguarded sound that had been largely absent from her these past months, and Margaret embraced her warmly, welcoming her not merely as her brothers intended, but as a friend in her own right. The wedding took place the following spring, in the same garden behind Hartwell House where Julian had first proposed beneath the pear trees, now in full and fragrant bloom. Camilla attended alongside Andrew Whitfield, their own courtship having deepened steadily over the winter months, and their presence together drew warm smiles rather than the awkward tension anyone might have expected given the history between them all. Eleanor's father walked her down the garden path himself, his stern face softened with genuine happiness as he placed her hand in Julian's before the assembled guests. I trust, he said quietly to Julian, that you have learned the lesson this past year taught you thoroughly. I have, Julian said, meeting his gaze steadily. I intend to spend the rest of my life proving it, sir, one honest day at a time. The ceremony itself was simple, without the grand spectacle that had marked the ballroom announcement so many months before, though everyone present agreed it carried far more genuine joy than any elaborate display could have offered. Vows were spoken beneath the same pear trees where a proposal had once been made in secret, and this time nothing remained hidden, no debts concealed, no letters left unsent, no silence standing between two people who had learned, through considerable pain, the true cost of choosing pride over honesty. That evening, as the wedding celebration continued beneath strings of lantern light hung through the garden, Julian found a quiet moment alone with Eleanor near the same stone bridge where their reconciliation had first begun. Do you remember, he asked, standing here months ago, uncertain whether you had made the right choice in coming at all? I remember, Eleanor said, leaning against the worn stone railing beside him. I remember thinking I might never trust you again, and being terrified that some small part of me already had, despite everything. And now? Julian asked. Now, Eleanor said, turning to face him fully, I find I have no fear left at all, only gratitude, that we found our way back to honesty in time to build something real between us. Julian drew her close, and together they watched the water pass beneath the bridge in the gathering darkness, the same water that had carried away so much doubt and uncertainty over the past year, now flowing steadily onward beneath a marriage built at last on nothing hidden, nothing unspoken, and nothing left to silence between two people who had learned, through hardship, exactly what honesty was truly worth. They returned to the garden together as the last of the lantern light flickered warmly against the darkening sky, and Margaret met them near the edge of the celebration, her own eyes bright with happiness she made no effort to disguise. The guests are asking after the two of you, she said, though her tone carried no real urgency, content simply to have found them together, though I confess I do not blame you both for slipping away for a quiet moment. We were remembering, Eleanor said, how far we have come since that bridge first brought us back together. Margaret smiled warmly. It seems fitting, then, that your first dance as husband and wife should take place beneath the very stars that watched over that reconciliation. She led them back toward the garden center, where the musicians had begun a slower melody in anticipation of the newlyweds' return, and the gathered guests parted to allow Julian and Eleanor space at the heart of the celebration. As the music swelled, Julian took his wife's hand and led her into the first dance of their marriage, and this time, unlike the ballroom 6 months before, every eye that turned toward them carried only warmth and genuine joy. Henry Ashworth watched his daughter dance from the edge of the gathering, his usually stern face unable to fully hide his contentment. Charlotte stood beside him, having grown fond of the entire Hartwell family over the months of careful courtship she had witnessed unfold. She looks happier than I have seen her in years, Charlotte observed quietly. She does, Henry agreed. I confess I doubted, that first week after the ball, whether any happiness could grow again from such a painful beginning. I am glad, for both their sakes, that I was wrong. Nearby, Camilla watched the dancing couple with Andrew Whitfield's arm resting comfortably around her own, no trace of bitterness remaining in her expression, only quiet satisfaction at how completely the story had resolved itself for everyone involved. Do you regret it? Andrew asked her softly, releasing him all those months ago? Not for a single moment, Camilla answered honestly. I have found something with you these past months that I never once felt during my engagement to Julian, however comfortable that arrangement might have seemed at the time. I am grateful, strange as it sounds, for the scandal that forced all of us toward honesty in the end. Andrew squeezed her hand gently, and together they watched the newlyweds complete their first dance, the music winding gracefully to its close as the gathered guests applauded warmly. Later that night, once the celebration had finally begun to wind down and most of the guests had departed for their own homes, Julian and Eleanor walked once more through the quiet garden, the pear trees standing silent witness above them in the darkness. "I have been thinking," Eleanor said, "of everything that happened in that ballroom 6 months ago. The humiliation of it, the anger, the year of silence before it. I used to believe that night was the worst of my life." "And now?" Julian asked. "Now I believe it was simply the beginning of something neither of us could have reached any other way," Eleanor said. "Had you never made that announcement, had I never walked through those doors and seen the truth so plainly, I do not know that either of us would have found the courage to face what needed facing. The debts, the pride, the silence. It took that public wound to force us both toward something real." Julian considered this as they walked, the truth of it settling over him slowly. "I would not wish to relive that night for anything," he said. "But I understand what you mean. Sometimes the breaking of something is what finally allows it to be rebuilt properly, on a foundation strong enough to last." And they paused beneath the largest of the pear trees, the very one beneath which Julian had first proposed more than a year and a half before, and Eleanor rested her head against his shoulder, listening to the quiet sounds of the garden settling into night around them. "Whatever comes next," she said softly, "the debts still to be settled, the years of careful management still ahead of us. I find I am no longer afraid of it, not the way I once was, when silence stood between us instead of honesty." "Nor am I," Julian said, drawing her closer. "Whatever difficulties the future holds, I intend to face them beside you, openly, rather than alone and hidden away in shame as I once did." Above them, the stars had fully emerged now, scattered brightly across the clear spring sky, indifferent as ever to the small dramas of the people beneath them, and yet somehow, standing there together beneath the pear trees where everything had first begun, Eleanor felt as though even the stars themselves seemed to shine a little warmer on this particular night, blessing quietly a love that had survived its most difficult trial, and emerged, at last, whole. Inside the house, the last of the servants moved quietly through the ballroom, extinguishing candles one by one, the golden light dimming gradually, until only the moon remained to illuminate the room where a scandal had once unfolded, and where, tonight, a marriage had been celebrated in its place. Margaret paused at the threshold before retiring, looking back at the empty room, remembering the frightened, ashamed brother she had found there 6 months before, hiding a bundle of unsent letters in his desk drawer. She smiled to herself, closed the door softly behind her, and made her way upstairs, content in the knowledge that whatever difficulties still lay ahead for the newly married couple, they would face them together, honestly, exactly as a marriage ought to be built from its very foundation onward. 2 years after the wedding beneath the pear trees, Hartwell House looked nothing like the estate that had once teetered so close to ruin. The tenant farms, managed now under fair and transparent arrangements, produced their finest harvests in a generation. The shipping venture, once nearly abandoned in despair, had grown into a steady and respectable source of income, overseen personally by Julian through regular correspondence and, twice yearly, brief visits to the ports where it operated. The debts that had once threatened the Hartwell name entirely had been settled in full, a full year ahead of the original terms Julian had negotiated so honestly with the bank. Eleanor stood now in the same garden where her wedding had taken place, watching her husband walk slowly along the garden path with their infant daughter cradled carefully against his shoulder, murmuring something too quiet for Eleanor to hear from where she stood near the roses. The child, named Alice after Julian's late mother, had arrived just before the winter, and Julian had taken to fatherhood with the same quiet dedication he had once poured into rebuilding his family's fortune. Margaret approached from the house, carrying a small stack of letters that had arrived that morning, and found Eleanor smiling as she watched her husband and daughter together beneath the pear trees. "He has not put her down in nearly an hour," Margaret said, amused. "The estate steward has been waiting outside his study since breakfast." "Let the steward wait a little longer," Eleanor said. "There will be time enough for ledgers this afternoon." Margaret handed over the letters, and Eleanor sorted through them idly, pausing on one bearing a familiar hand. It was from Camilla, now married to Andrew Whitfield for nearly a year, writing to share news of their own recent engagement announcement for her younger sister, and to ask, warmly, whether Eleanor and Julian might attend the celebration in the coming month. "She writes so often now," Margaret observed, glancing over Eleanor's shoulder. "I confess I never expected such a friendship to grow between the three of you, given how it all began." "Nor did I," Eleanor admitted. But perhaps that is what happens when honesty finally replaces whatever came before it. Wounds heal strangely sometimes, into something sturdier than what existed before the breaking. She folded Camilla's letter and set it aside, watching as Julian finally noticed her attention and made his way over. Little Alice now drowsy against his shoulder, her small fist curled loosely around a fold of his coat. "She has finally settled," he said quietly, careful not to wake the child. "I believe the steward has given up waiting and gone home for the afternoon." "Then perhaps you might join us for tea instead," Eleanor suggested, "before ledgers claim the rest of your day." Julian smiled, the easy, unguarded smile that had returned to him fully in the 2 years since their wedding, so different from the anxious, shame-burdened expression he had carried through that first difficult year of silence. "I believe I would like nothing better." They settled together beneath the largest of the pear trees, Margaret joining them with a fresh pot of tea, and for a while the three of them simply sat in comfortable quiet, watching the afternoon light shift slowly through the branches above, little Alice sleeping peacefully against her father's chest. "Do you ever think of that night?" Julian asked eventually, breaking the companionable silence. "The ballroom, I mean. The announcement." "Sometimes," Eleanor admitted, "though it feels now like something that happened to two entirely different people. I can barely remember the fear I felt standing in that doorway, though I remember it happened." "I think of it more often than I would like to admit," Julian said. "Not with regret exactly, more as a reminder of what silence can cost, when pride convinces a person that hiding is somehow protection." "It taught us both a great deal," Margaret offered, refilling her own cup, "though I confess I would not wish the lesson on anyone twice." Eleanor reached over and took Julian's free hand, the one not occupied with supporting their sleeping daughter, and squeezed it gently. "Whatever it cost us then, I would not trade what we have built since, not for anything." "Nor would I," Julian agreed, and the warmth in his voice carried none of the desperate uncertainty that had once colored every conversation between them in the difficult months following the scandal. Later that evening, once Alice had been settled properly into her nursery and Margaret had retired for the night, Julian and Eleanor walked together to the stone bridge that had witnessed so much of their reconciliation 2 years before. The water moved beneath them just as it always had, steady and unhurried, indifferent to the years that had passed since Eleanor first stood there reading his unsent letters by the light of a borrowed candle. "I received word today," Julian said, "that the last of the estate's original debts has been cleared entirely. We stand now exactly as my father once claimed we did, though this time the claim happens to be true." Eleanor smiled, leaning against the worn stone railing beside him. "You have done what he never managed, and done it honestly, without hiding a single part of the struggle from anyone who asked." "I could not have done it without you," Julian said. "Your patience, when I had earned so little of it. Your willingness to wait and watch rather than simply walking away entirely, as you would have been entirely justified in doing." "I nearly did walk away," Eleanor admitted. "More than once, in those early weeks, I told myself I was a fool for even considering forgiveness. But something in those letters, in the honesty of your grief across that year of silence, convinced me that the man who wrote them was worth the risk of trusting again." Julian drew her close, and they stood together in comfortable silence as the last light of evening faded fully into night. The same bridge, the same water, the same quiet garden that had witnessed the slow, careful rebuilding of everything between them. "Alice will grow up hearing this story eventually," Eleanor said softly. "The scandal, the letters, the long road back to honesty. I wonder what she will make of it, hearing it as a story rather than living it as we did." "I hope," Julian said, "that she learns from it what took us both far too long to understand ourselves. That silence, however well-intentioned, causes far more damage than the difficult truths we fear to speak aloud, and that love, however deeply wounded, can still find its way back to wholeness, provided both people are willing to do the honest work required to rebuild it." Eleanor nodded, resting her head against his shoulder as the stars began to emerge overhead, scattered across the darkening sky exactly as they had been on the night of their wedding 2 years before. Whatever challenges still lay ahead, the harvest still to be gathered, the child still to be raised, the years of marriage still unfolding before them, she felt certain, standing there on the bridge where it had all truly begun to heal, that they would face every one of them together, honestly, exactly as they had promised each other beneath the pear trees on the day they finally became husband and wife. The house behind them glowed warmly in the darkness, candlelight flickering steady in its windows, no longer the golden backdrop to scandal and heartbreak it had once been, but simply the quiet light of a home built at last on nothing hidden, nothing left unspoken, and nothing standing any longer between two people who had learned, through considerable hardship, exactly what their love was worth. In the weeks that followed, the estate settled into the particular rhythm of early autumn, the harvest gathered and stored, the tenant farms preparing for the coming winter under arrangements that had proven, season after season, far more sustainable than anything Julian's father had ever managed. Julian spent his mornings now with a lighter step than the anxious pacing that had once carried him between his study and the bank, the weight of concealed debt no longer pressing against every conversation he had with his neighbors or his tenants. Eleanor, for her part, had taken an increasing interest in the estate's affairs herself, sitting beside Julian some evenings as he reviewed the ledgers, offering observations that more than once proved sharper than his own. She had grown, in the 2 years since their wedding, into a partner in every sense of the word, not merely a wife who waited quietly at home while her husband managed matters alone, but a woman whose judgment he sought deliberately on questions large and small. "You have a talent for numbers," Julian told her one evening, reviewing a proposal she had suggested regarding the shipping venture's expansion. "I begin to wonder whether Edmund Caro ought to worry for his position." Eleanor laughed. "I have simply had a great deal of practice watching you struggle through these same figures for 2 years running." Some understanding was bound to develop eventually. Margaret, who had taken to spending increasing time at a small cottage on the estate's edge rather than the main house, visited often enough that little Alice had come to know her aunt's face as well as her own parents. On one such visit, sharing tea in the same garden where so much had unfolded, Margaret mentioned, almost in passing, that she had received an offer of marriage herself, from a quiet gentleman farmer 2 estates over who had been courting her patiently for the better part of a year. "And what have you decided?" Eleanor asked, setting down her cup with evident interest. "I have decided to accept him," Margaret said, a faint blush coloring her usually composed features. "Though I confess I never expected, watching my brother's disastrous courtship unfold those first difficult months, that I would find my own happiness following so closely behind his." "I could not be more pleased for you," Eleanor said sincerely, reaching over to embrace her sister-in-law warmly. "You have earned every bit of it, after everything you did to help guide Julian back toward honesty when he most needed the reminder." Julian, arriving in time to hear the tail end of the conversation, added his own congratulations heartily, and the small gathering beneath the pear trees turned, for the remainder of that afternoon, into a quiet celebration of a happiness that seemed, increasingly, to be spreading outward from the very garden where it had first taken root. That winter, as snow settled softly over the Hartwell estate, Eleanor sat by the fire in the same study where Julian had once kept his bundle of unsent letters locked away in shame. The drawer stood empty now, its contents long since delivered and read and folded away in the small box beside their bed, a reminder kept not out of pain but out of gratitude, for the honesty that had eventually replaced a year of silence. Alice, now old enough to toddle unsteadily between the furniture, made her determined way across the study floor toward her father, who scooped her up with the easy affection of a man who had learned, through hardship, precisely how much such small moments were worth. "She grows faster than the harvest reports," Julian observed, settling his daughter onto his knee. "Faster than either of us are quite ready for," Eleanor agreed, watching them both with the quiet contentment of a woman who had once feared she would never feel such peace again. Outside, the snow continued falling steadily over the pear trees, the stone bridge, the whole quiet estate that had weathered scandal and ruin and slowly, patiently, rebuilt itself into something sturdier and more honest than it had ever been before. And within the warm study, safe from the winter cold, a family sat together by the fire, their story no longer one of silence and hidden shame, but of honesty hard won, and love, once broken, mended carefully back into something whole.